MPs would do sort of more events a bit like this, actually to address obviously key concerns of constituents. And I think also just to, to start off, I think that actually also remembering that actually, people that are affected are actually our friends, they're our colleagues, they're our families in many cases, and in a lot of cases we wouldn't necessarily understand or sort of have any kind of idea about what people are going through and stuff like that. In other cases, yes. And I think it's really important to remember that this isn't just a far away abstract issue that I think some people would like to make it. And we can never underestimate the sort of strength of feeling that it exists. And I think it's really important to add that too. And also to add that I'm no way speaking on behalf of Palestinians. I think that's really important to add. These are, I work for an organisation that does a lot of political advocacy in Parliament, the Council for Arab-British Understanding, and including taking MPs and delegations, including Sarah. I'm very privileged to do that. And I think, we're keen to do obviously more and more of that sort of advocacy work. I think in terms of framing, it must be that it didn't just start with rockets. I think sometimes to make it seem as if it's just sort of rockets that have sort of led to all of this, particularly in Gaza, I think is false. And these are obviously rightly condemned because obviously firing rockets into civilian areas constitutes a war crime. But this is also a continued struggle for Palestinian rights, which many, I believe rightly, have actually labelled as apartheid. You can look at the Human Rights Watch report and the Bett report, but also I think endless Palestinian voices, which I think have spoken about it as such for years. Palestinian voices and organisations which I think have, lives, I think, which have been dominated by dispossession, displacement, demolition, checkpoints, police and other Israeli force brutality, child detentions, military raids, settlement expansion, which were also carried out with impunity and a lack of accountability. For example, those in Gaza, which obviously are under siege, under blockade. A 15-year-old in Gaza has endured four major wars in 2006, 2009, 2012, 2014, and obviously the Great March of Return as well, and the events around that, and on top of everything else in terms of daily living and such like. So we can't just simply frame it as what is happening now. I think, in terms, there's a lot of talk about de-escalation and also the status quo. Unless these issues are properly addressed, that the fundamentals, I think, of impingements on Palestinian rights properly addressed, and these cycles will continue, they'll carry on. We will see this in another couple of years' time. We'll see the rockets also returning, time after time, the same stuff will keep on happening. And then also we'll see the same rhetoric from our politicians. These cycles will keep continuing, and the bombs may stop dropping on Gaza, but do actually the sort of human rights violations cease? Obviously, we've seen a lot of what motivated sort of current issues was obviously the turfing out of families in Sheikh Jarrah. These are families that were displaced in the Nakba in 1948, and it is considered a war crime to displace and displace a population which is occupied. And this is not just happening in Sheikh Jarrah, it's happening also across other parts of the West Bank, and we're including East Jerusalem in the West Bank, by the way. But this triggered and motivated something which I think for people that are watchers of this issue, it wasn't surprising. It wasn't a sort of shock that came out of nowhere for some of the reasons that I listed before, in terms of these daily violations and sort of historic issues which have existed. I think the international community often acts as if it's surprise. It's surprised that this is happening. It's surprised that people are kind of rising up in such a way. But the responses typically are not adequate from the British government. It's no wonder, I think, that Palestinians have little or zero faith in these responses and in this kind of, dealing with it, when I think the responses are pro forma, they're rehearsed, they're rehashed. Every Middle East minister has said pretty much the same thing for time after time, because it comes with zero consequences and it comes with zero accountability. The calls for an investigation, I think, into violations and serious breaches, serious international law breaches in the occupied Palestinian territory don't come from nowhere rather. And I think the UK government and the Labour Party and other political parties, I think, should be calling for this kind of accountability and support for this investigation. I think also in terms of, we have to look in terms of, the US. It's obviously pretty disappointing, but actually I think for many of us actually not necessarily surprising that President Biden has taken such an approach. I think he never really felt that this was going to be a huge issue under his presidency, but I think it's a colossal miscalculation, and I think one which is actually morally bankrupt. Obviously, there's a lot of changes that have taken place in the US, not least in the Democratic Party. It's not just from the squad, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and others. And I think actually these positions, which also exist in the UK, are actually significantly out of step. Political positions which are significantly out of step with actually voices in their own party, people across the UK, communities across the UK, including Jewish communities in the UK and in the US. And I think others can obviously speak better on that. But also, I think fundamentally completely out of kilter with actually where Palestinian voices are what they're saying, what they're talking about. And I think there's an urgent question today, and a lot of the responses from parliamentarians, and some obviously with all due respect, I think actually fail to grasp, I think, some of the significance and actually the acute needs and demands that Palestinians have. And this includes demands from British Palestinians, American Palestinians, and others, and all those, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, Lebanon, Syria, wherever. I think there are so many instances, I think, where actually UK policy and US policy is actually significantly out of step. I think, when you see actually some of the Palestinian unity that's on display across the West Bank with Palestinian citizens of Israel in Gaza, I think it's phenomenal, and also diaspora voices as well. I think we risk either sometimes as organizations, sometimes for our politics being completely out of touch and well behind a wave which actually is seemingly quite unstoppable at the moment. And justified, the waves which are behind us, sort of justified feeling, that people are unwilling, and nor should they ever have been willing, to tolerate sort of steadfastness or tolerate lives which are, impacted by serious and often very basic denials of rights and various other things. And I think also, the feeling also which exists, I think, from people in the UK as well. I think that's only going to increase. Politicians will get more and more letters from constituents, from communities. I know, time after time, I think the British Muslim community, for example, has always been very, very active. And, not least because of Al-Aqsa, but, other things. It's, it'd be crude, I think, just to pin it down to one thing. And I think, even in Parliament, I think, there's a lot of talk, I think, at the moment of the Red Wall and new Tory MPs that I think represent actually potentially far more diverse seats than they ever did before. These politicians, I think, will have to face issues and face discussions from constituents who care so much about Palestine. Often one of the criticisms that you always get, and there was an article the other day about, people in Hartlepool and in Rotherham or wherever, they don't care about Palestine. It doesn't affect them. I think this is actually, I think it comes from this idea that actually somehow, say, white working class communities don't care about issues that actually affect them. They don't, somehow that they don't care about people in Gaza that are enduring bombs, or even people in Tel Aviv that are enduring rockets, that somehow they don't care about the cost of human life. And I think this is obviously both a racist and a classist kind of assertion that's made. I think people do care. People, are, rightly very, very concerned about what is happening. And I think to sort of pin it down to just being some kind of left-wing issue or an elite sort of discussion, I think is absolutely false. I think I want to just conclude, and I probably have gone on over time a little bit, but I suppose it's a slight appeal, because, as heartbreaking as obviously the events are, and I think it impacts us all in various ways. As I said, these are our friends, these are our colleagues, these are our loved ones, these are our families. I think sometimes, there is so much hatred and anger that exists in all sorts of forms in this country at the moment, not just this country either. And I think we have to always be mindful and conscious never to add more to that fire. There's so many people willing to set up these bonfires, but nobody's ever willing to ever properly put it out or ever assist. So I think that this includes how we respond, the language we use. That we're rightly condemning anti-Semitism where it has been used, I think, to bastardize, I think, the Palestinian cause. And I think it's quite significant, just on this issue, that actually Palestinians, the people that are enduring bombings in Gaza, actually across social media took the time out to say, do you know what, we reject the way in which you've handled our cause, you've handled our issue. We reject the hatred, and also we reject the sort of anti-Palestinian racism, I think, which is so prevalent at the moment and which exists. That it's phenomenal that we're getting Palestinian voices that are on our media, that are speaking to politicians and such like. But with that also comes this sort of really nasty and insidious sort of anti-Palestinian racism, which tries to shut down any discussion that Palestinians are trying to raise or trying to approach. And I think we really need to stamp out some of this and actually continue to amplify those voices and to continue a discourse which is based in international law, that is based in what is morally correct, and what is actually is helping to bring about justice for Palestinians.
Joe, thank you very much. Your passion comes across very, very clearly. I mean, for me, this has always been a straight human rights and legal issue, and I'm very clear that that is often being broken. And one of the areas that I've done a lot of campaigning around is around Palestinian child detainees, who detaining a child, but particularly detaining a child in another country, breaches an awful lot of international human rights and international laws. And I've been very fortunate that I've worked with both Tareq and Sawsan on that, which is why I wanted them here on this call. I wonder, Sawsan, if I could start with you, and I know that you also have a video that you'd like us to play, and then if we can move to Tareq. When do you want the video? Do you want the video first, Sawsan, or do you want it afterwards?
At the end would be wonderful, thank you.
You want it now, yeah?
No, at the end after I finish speaking, if
no
that's
problem.
all right.
I'm afraid I can, just because of time, and we do have a lot of people wanting questions, 5 minutes, please.
Fine, of course. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for organising this event, and thank you as well for your kind of historic advocacy for Palestinian child prisoners. So my name is Sawsan, and I'm the UK Advocacy Officer at DCI-Palestine. We're a local Palestinian charity and the only one that works specifically to protect the rights of Palestinian children. Our work is divided into child protection and accountability, and we're most known for our global campaign to end the military detention of Palestinian children, which is called No Way to Treat a Child. I have a lot to say and not a lot of time to say it, so I hope you'll forgive me if I read to you my notes, because as an organisation that is mainly documenting what we do, there are a lot of facts that I'd like to read you today. And it would take more than the time we have this evening to adequately summarise the scale of the impact upon children of the ongoing military offensive on Gaza, which of course exists within the context of Israel's protracted closure of Gaza. So I thought it might be timely, given the escalating situation in Gaza this week, to give you an overview of our documentation from the last week and revisit what happened in Gaza in 2014, which I think presented across 50 days many of the central policies and practices that typify Israel's treatment of Palestinian children, namely the indiscriminate manner in which Israeli forces have and continue to kill civilians, including children, the shameless disregard for international law, and the creation of an environment in Gaza and in the rest of occupied Palestine where there is no safe place for children. We have so far independently verified that 63 Palestinian children have been killed in this latest offensive, officially making these hostilities deadlier for Palestinian children than Operation Pillar of Cloud in 2012. We publish daily updates about each of these child fatalities and injuries on our website if you'd like to read those. All the evidence indicates that Israeli forces have unlawfully targeted individual civilians and civilian structures, resulting in the killing of children. Carrying out an attack that is not directed at a specific military objective constitutes an indiscriminate attack and amounts to a war crime. The firing of artillery shells in close proximity to civilians and civilian infrastructure also constitutes an indiscriminate attack. This time last week, Israeli forces deployed artillery shells against civilians, killing 17-year-old Fawzia Abu Faris and her 9-month-old nephew, Mohammed Abu Daya, in al-Nasir village in the northern Gaza Strip. 3 Israeli-fired artillery shells struck the Abu Faris' one-story house, killing Fawzia Mohammed and dismembering Fawzia's adult sisters, Nisreen and Sabreen, just as they celebrated Eid in their living room with 20 other family members. The effects of artillery shells cannot be limited as required by international law and should never be used. Since last Thursday, many thousands of Palestinians have fled their homes and are sheltering in schools, mosques and other places, but we know from the actions of Israeli forces during Operation Protective Edge in 2014 that these places are not safe. During Operation Protective Edge, which lasted 50 days, Israeli forces killed at least 2,220 Palestinians in Gaza, of whom the majority were civilians, according to the UN. Nowhere in the Gaza Strip was safe during OPE, as Israeli forces indiscriminately targeted densely populated residential areas as it is doing now. We found overwhelming and repeated evidence that Israeli forces committed grave violations of international humanitarian law, some of which amounted to war crimes, including attacks on places in which civilians were known to be sheltering, like homes and schools, and the direct targeting of children by Israeli drone-fired missiles. Israeli forces killed children at a rate of 1 child every hour during the height of the violence. We independently verified the deaths of 547 Palestinian children among the dead in Gaza, 535 of them as a direct result of Israeli attacks. Almost 68% of these children were 12 or younger, and at the time of the operation, during which Israeli forces killed 164 children in drone strikes, Israel was the world's largest exporter of aerial drones. But the cost to children of OPE did not end with the ceasefire agreement. Several children died in the months following OPE, including 3 infants who died of hypothermia the following January. All 3 were from one of the 18,000 housing units that were damaged or destroyed during Operation Protective Edge. A 4th child, a 4-year-old, died after picking up an unexploded hand grenade left behind by an Israeli soldier who had unlawfully occupied his home in Beit Hanun, North Gaza. The UN estimates suggest that 370,000 Palestinian children required immediate psychosocial support following OPE. Over 1,000 children were permanently disabled. OPE, I think, gives us a good indication of the consequences for children of this military offensive continuing. I'm happy to answer any more questions about Gaza, but I'll move on to briefly speak about military detention for now. I was asked by Sarah to briefly provide some information about military detention, and I had originally intended to give you a summary about our extensive documentation of Israel's military detention system and our global campaign, No Way to Treat a Child. To summarize it very briefly, like all Palestinians, Palestinian children have been historically denied recognition as civilians and are the only children in the world who are automatically and systematically prosecuted within a military detention system, Israel's military detention system. Israel prosecutes between 500 and 700 Palestinian children in military courts each year, and we estimate that since 2000, Israeli military authorities have detained, interrogated, prosecuted, and imprisoned around 13,000 Palestinian children. However, in the last 2 days, we as a staff team have been mourning the loss of a child who is much loved in our organization, called Abida. We made a film with Abida in 2019 alongside the filmmaker Matthew Cassell, in which Abida talked about his experience of the military detention system. At the time, Abida was 15 years old, and Israeli forces had already arrested and detained him twice on an accusation that he had thrown stones. Our film resonated very widely with people around the world and was screened by governmental agencies, civil society organisations, and thousands of others, and Abida became an important voice and a greatly loved child because of the hope that he expressed that he would one day be free. 2 days ago, an Israeli soldier shot Abida in the heart, killing him just a month shy of his 18th birthday and his graduation as a young chef from a YMCA program. Abida lived in Al Arub refugee camp near the southern occupied West Bank city of Hebron. He was near a demonstration at the entrance of the camp when an Israeli soldier stationed around 70 meters, 230 feet away, fired the fatal shot, according to the eyewitnesses that we interviewed. Abida did not pose a threat to that soldier, nor to anyone else when he was killed. Israeli forces blocked the entrance to Al Arub camp, preventing an ambulance from reaching Abida. He was later transported in a private car to a nearby medical center, where he was pronounced dead. Abida's story now illustrates just how much injustice and suffering Israeli authorities will put Palestinian children through before they do finally kill them. I thought it would be better today to allow Abida to explain to you Israel's military detention and trial of Palestinian children, and to show you the film Abida.
Thank you very much, Sawsan. And if it's okay with the audience, we'll now show Abida's film, if you just bear with me while I share my screen.
أول شيء بقيت أفكر كيف بدي أطلع، كيف بدي أمشي أيامي. تحسك إنك لما بقيت جوا بقيت منعزل عن العالم الخارجي تماما. عندك خوف إنك تنسجن كمان مرة ولا كيف. شو المشكلة الرئيسية؟ خط 60 إنه بس كيف تقطع وتفجرون المخيم، لأنه عند خط 60 هم ملك الشارع. أنا عبيد أكرم جوابرة، مخيم العروب، شمال الخليل، عمري تقريبا 15 سنة وبحب أطبخ. عندك مخيم العروب كله دور صغيرة وعدد الأفراد اللي فيها كبير كثير ومساحة الدور صغيرة، حتى إنه الشباك مثلا بفتح على شباك جارك، يعني الحيط في الحيط زي ما يسموها. وعندك توقك صغيرة، عندك برضو الناس فيها كثير طيبين، كثير مناح، جدعان، وقفوا معك في المشاكل. فيش حياة الأطفال مأساوية، لا في ألعاب زي العالم، لا في حرية. تم اعتقالي مرتين من قبل الاحتلال. عندي كانت تجربة الأولى مأساوية جدا، حتى كنت أنا ماشي أروح على الدكان أشتري، اعتقلوني. لما اعتقلوني في مركز التحقيق حطوا لي كلبش بلاستيك، كلبشتين نفس الشيء في نفس الإيد، حتى كان دقيق ما بقدرش أحرك إيدي لا لفوق ولا لتحت. كان حطوا لي عصب خميلة وحتى حطوها لمنخاري ما قدرش أتنفس بصعوبة. تعرف لما تمشي وأنت مش شايف إشي، طريق غريب، ضلك ماشي وضلك في شيء دايخ وخايف ومتردد. حتى هم كانوا مثلا يقول لي انزل الدرج، ما بقاش في درج، يقول ارفع رجلك نخلون اقع. اصلا ما كان ما يضربش الا على المناطق الغير حساسه، حتى ما تشهدش ضدهم او تثبتش اشاره ضدهم. صارت اشياء كثير لما وقفت في السجن وروحت شفت اشياء كثير متغيره. لما رجعت كانت المواد كلها متراكمه جدا علي، حتى انه ما عرفتش لا اختار لا هذا ولا هذا.
هاي مثلا ترتبها شويه هيك، لان في عندنا انواع يتم تشكيلها بالبذور، في عندنا انواع بالفسائل بالعقل، كويس. هاي مثلا نوع من انواع النبات يتم تشكيله ايش؟ من خلال النبته نفسها. في عندنا التكاثر الجنسي وفي عندنا التكاثر اللاجنسي، كويس.
رحت على الصناعيه عشان المواد برضو كانت متراكمه جدا، وعملوا لي امتحانات شهرين فتغلبت كثير. كنت كل يوم بقيت اقرا كل كتاب.
لما تشعل شو بتعمل؟ تبعد ايدك 2 ميلي،
انه اجيب علامات عاليه انه اثبت وجود، انه ما راحش تعبكم وهيك، ما راحش انكم قبلتوني راح تاثر علي طول في السجن.
انا رشيد عرار، المرشد المهني لمدرسه العروب الزراعيه. وزي ما احنا شايفين هون هذا الشارع، شارع 60 اللي بمر منه كثير من المستوطنين اللي بيعملوا لنا إشكالية كبيرة في هذا المكان، لأنه إحنا موجودين على
ايش هذا صوت؟
هذا الجرس. احنا موجودين على منطقة احتكاك بيؤدي لأنه مرات يصير في اعتداءات من قبل قوات الاحتلال على الأطفال، اعتقالات، مداهمات للمدرسة. الأطفال أول ما بيجوا سواء كان معتقل قبل ما يجي عنا أو بيتم اعتقاله عنا وبعدين بيلتحق بالمدرسة، بنجد إنه في صعوبة أثناء دمجه مع الطلاب. يعني مش بالسهل إنه يتفاعل، مش بالسهل إنه يبني علاقات، مش بالسهل إنه يبني صداقات. مرات عنده ردات فعل مش محسوبة. هذا الموضوع بنشتغل عليه على إنه نعيده لتوازنه، نعيده لإنه يرجع يندمج مع الأطفال، يبني علاقات، ينتظم بالمدرسة، يتخلص من بعض السلوكيات اللي شوي بتأثر عليه من ناحية سلبية.
بلشت افكر ليش احنا غير عن الاطفال العالم، ليش بس تعيين فلسطين بروحوا بتسجلوا اعمارهم صغيره ويندهكوا في الحياه وهم غير مبسوطين، بروحوا على جيم، على كره سله، على تدريبات، عندهم امكانيات كثير احسن منا. كنت اقارن كيف ليش هم هيك واحنا هيك. هذا السؤال لحد الان ما حدا جاوب عليه. ليش رحت الزراعة الكلية؟
نباتي وعشان الحيوان والنفع علاقات تدور.
أنا تعرف ليش رحت؟ عشان أشرت المواد العلمية، فيزياء وكيمياء وأحياء،
صعوبات كثير.
أنا أشرت منهم. ومنيح الزراعة، يعني وظيفة محترمة ورا مكتب وتشتغل لحالك وقاعد نفسك. أنا هذا الشيء اللي بحبه. دوك تكون ورا مكتب بعدين يداوموا عليك سوي هيك سوي هيك، عملت نفسك أحسن.
صحيح. لما كنا جوا بس نفكر، بس يوم نطلع محكمة عشان هيك نضيع وقت.
الزراعة
محكمة. الزراعة.
قلنا شوف بلاد بلدنا قلنا البصر.
بلاد بلدنا ويوم الزيارات وهيك. يوم الزيارة تشوف أهلك. هاي الأشياء المنيحة في السجن. شيء منيح هو، بس في أشياء بتعلمك إنه
زي الصبر في الابتلاء،
زي تصبر، تنظم حالك.
كنت مروت انا بالسجن طبخ جوا. شوف تعبد تعرف.
بعرف.
علم بالطبخ، حبني الشاب وعلم بالطبخ. وعندنا كان جابوا شيف من الأقسام الثانية إنه أطلع 3-2 معهم اسمه مساعد الطباخ، فاشتغلنا معه وعلمنا شغلة. تعلمت مهارة الطبخ، وتعلمت مهارة التعامل مع الناس، الأدب، الاحترام. بحس حالي حر، بس مش الحرية التامة. عندك لازم أول شيء تتحرر عشان أحس حالي حر تماما. بس برضه في عندك إنك حر، تطلع وقت ما بدك، تيجي وقت ما بدك، تشوف تاكسي، تحكي ما بدك، تزاحم ما بدك. كان عندك خلاص إرادة شخصية، شو بدك تسوي. أنا هذا كنت مفتقده جوا. بس واحد مش متحرر كيف بدي أعيش الفرح تمام 100%. يعني حتى جزء من الفرح اكتمل. أول شيء بدأت أفكر كيف بدي أطلع.
Sawsan, just please express our deepest sympathies to Abaida's family. What a waste of a young and beautiful life, and thank you so much for all that Defence for Children International do. I want to bring in Tareq at this point. Tareq's the director of the Lawyers for Palestinian and for Palestinians, and he particularly works on human rights issues. I've had the pleasure of working with him for a number of years now, but I've also been to the detention and processing centres that Palestinian children have been taken to. And if I say to the audience that they are a truly chilling experience as an adult. So to go there as a child, I can't even imagine. And unfortunately, I've met some of the children, now adults, who have been through that process, and it creates lifelong scars. I do want to say at this point that I condemn violence on all sides and the loss of civilian and indeed forces lives on all sides. And this debate is very much about how to resolve the ongoing conflict peacefully so that no human life is lost. But I think particularly because of the international violations that are happening to Palestinian children in particular, I think it's worth us focusing on that. And if I could bring Tareq in at this point to try and explain us what the legal situation is, both sort of internationally and from a human rights perspective, it would be really good to have your view on that, because I know that's what you focus on. Thank you, Tareq, and thank you, Sawsan.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Chair and Sawsan. It's really great honour, as always, to follow you both, and my condolences as well to your Labour's family. As Sarah said a few minutes ago, actually, how I view this situation, I view it similarly to Sarah, that this is a major human rights problem, and it should be viewed that way. And at the heart of it is violations of international law. And without any accountability, without consequences. And my view of the current situation is that this represents a collective failure of the international community to respond adequately to what has been the status quo for decades now, which is non-compliance with international law at the heart of it. And so how do we go forward from this? In 2014, I was documenting the violations taking place in Gaza, and to follow on from what Sawsan was sadly reading, 370 children were killed inside their homes in the 2014 hostilities. 370 children. 292 women killed inside their homes. Homes were being attacked on a deliberate, systematic and widespread scale during the 2014 hostilities. It was the UN Commission for Inquiry said that it was the key feature of the 2014 hostilities. And they pointed to their serious concerns that it appeared that that violations of international humanitarian law and international criminal law took place, including by the highest level decision makers in the Israeli government and Israeli military. Since then, there has been, thus far, no accountability. There hasn't even been a genuine investigation. Israel is carrying out what they term to be investigations, but from our assessment and the assessments of many Palestinian, well, of all Palestinian Israeli human rights organizations, those investigations are not genuine. And this absence of accountability leads really only to one thing. It emboldens repetition of violations. And that's what we're seeing now in 2021, 7 years later. We're seeing the repetition of homes being targeted and children, women, men, and civilians dying inside their own homes. And it's an outrage. And maybe it's even more outrageous because it's foreseeable because this is the consequence when there is no accountability, when there are no genuine investigations, and that the international community can really stand by and allow this to happen. I would like to touch upon at this point, but maybe come up during the Q&A, that there is some hope in the form of the International Criminal Court, and they have recently opened an investigation into the situation in Palestine after a 6-year preliminary examination into the issue. One thing, though, that I should highlight is that Boris Johnson wrote a letter to the Conservative Friends of Israel last month saying that he does not support the investigation into the situation in Palestine. And this is, I would say, well, it's unacceptable interference with the independence of the International Criminal Court. And it should not be tolerable. It is not tolerable. And I think it's unprecedented as well for the UK for the UK government to actually speak out against the opening of an investigation by the International Criminal Court into a situation. So yeah, sorry, Sarah, I can really actually talk so much about this, but I should probably stop there and save myself for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Tareq. As ever, you put so much of yourself into this, and you really do make a difference. And like you, I try to focus on the human rights issues and the legalities around it. And I personally wish that others did the same, because that's where we can make the strongest arguments as far as I'm concerned. I now want to bring in Danielle from Yachad, a great organisation that mobilises British Jewish people to try and find a political solution to what's going on between Israel and Palestine. One of the things that pains me most is this smear that Jewish people do not care about what's happening, which is utter nonsense, and to be quite honest, as far as I'm concerned, racist dogma that we should stamp out at every possible occasion we can find it. I am yet to find people that don't care about human rights violations, and I'm incredibly grateful that Danielle is doing the work that she does and the work that Yachad does to try and tackle and, well, to try and address through politics and through grown-up conversations a solution to where we find ourselves at the moment. And I'm very, very grateful that you're here to talk to us today, Danielle, about what your organisation does, but also maybe some suggestions about what we can do to get a political solution to this, because that's what's needed right now.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me, and it's been great to hear from everyone today. I don't really know how to follow on. I'll try and be as quick as possible. So just for context, I am British Israeli, and I'm in Tel Aviv at the moment as an Israeli Jewish progressive, which is an interesting fight. So Yachad, as Sarah mentioned, is a British Jewish movement that's been working for 10 years to essentially uplift progressive voices in the Jewish community, as well as progressive grassroots voices in Israel-Palestine who are working for peace. So, as you said, Jewish people care about Israel. It's a Jewish homeland, and we acknowledge that, and we're not against that. But caring about Israel also means criticizing Israel and fighting for it as a democracy, and fighting for justice for Palestinian rights as well, and for non-Jews in Israel. And we feel that in order to support Israel, we must be critical of it. Most of the work we do is around criticizing and opposing the occupation vehemently. We believe in a two-state solution, but often the conversation about the two-state solution seems to forget what the second state is, which is Palestine. And so a lot of our work is around focusing on the recognition of that. We believe in sovereignty and democracy for both people, and again, both people means Israelis and Palestinians, and not just Israelis. We have no problem criticizing Hamas and criticizing what Hamas is doing, but it has to be viewed in the context of the wider picture of what's happening at the moment. If I could just add to some of the context that Joseph Henley shared earlier, I think it's important to realize that what's happening at the moment is an escalation that everyone saw coming.
I think you have to remember that, first of all, Palestine was supposed to have its first elections in 15 years this year. Those have been postponed indefinitely. Israel has been stuck in an election cycle. We've had 4 elections in just over 2 years and unable to form a government, as well as everyone having been affected by COVID. We have ongoing occupation and absolutely no moves to try and resolve that. And not only that, but also settlement expansion being the active policy of the Israeli government. So I think that context has to be taken into account when you look at this, and not just this as a recent escalation. Yes, we support an absolutely urgent ceasefire, but also after the ceasefire, what's next? What's the plan? Because at the moment, there is no plan. And there have been a lot of statements in government around supporting peace and supporting a 2-state solution. But actually, that has to mean supporting a 2-state solution and actively bringing in partners to the table to work for that, to work for the ending of occupation, to work for the ending of military presence of the West Bank and the end of the siege on Gaza. And the voices that we mobilize are progressive voices that believe in democracy in Israel and freedom for Palestinian people and equality for Palestinians. So I think I'll probably stop there because I know that you're keen to get to questions as well, but I have to answer anything else.
Thank you ever so much. Really appreciate all that you say. It's interesting that you bring up the 2-state solution, because one of the questions we've had is around that. And can I just say to the audience, as an MP, I get lots of constituents contacting me about lots of different topics, but I've had, I would say, over 600 constituents contacting me about the recent escalation of violence, which is unprecedented for me. And we have last week and this week in Parliament raised an urgent question around this situation. And one of the things that was asked of Minister Cleverly today, which is one of the questions that people have submitted, is why has the UK not recognised Palestine as an independent state when the majority of UN members have? Very disappointingly, the government minister said, and I paraphrase, it will recognise Palestine as an independent state. This is the paraphrase, when it can help the peace process. I would say it would help the peace process right now if it was recognised. But I wonder, Danielle, do you think that that would make a significant difference if the UK did recognise Palestine as an independent state?
Just to add to what you've just said, what process would be my question. There is no peace process at the moment. So I think we shared Layla Moran's statement on this, which was excellent. So yes, we would advocate for the recognition of Palestine. I think the idea that it's not going to help a peace process, like I said, there isn't a peace process at the moment. There's no desire to bring partners to the table. Obviously, this isn't something that's going to be solved overnight. It is a process, like stopping the occupation is a process, ending the siege is a process. It's nothing that's going to happen overnight. But in order for both states and people to be treated equally, they have to be recognised in the same way.
I agree. Joe, could I ask you one of the questions? What steps should the UK government take to bring the cycle of violence to an end? And also, if you could comment on the broader issue of what the UK could do in relation to Israel and Palestine relations. But to roll another question in, could you comment about the US and the dynamics that's at play there as well, please, Joe?
Sure, that's quite a lot. But no, I think the first call has to be accountability. It has to be support for the ICC. I think it has to be support for the ICC's investigation. And I think also it has to be, there has to be sort of diplomatic consequences, which may include some form of sanctions on Israeli actions. And I think there's a lot of talk about sort of the ban of settlement goods. Settlement goods are not Israeli goods. The settlements are not Israel. I think that needs to be sort of hammered home, because actually the response you get from the government when you talk about the banning of settlement produce or the banning of operation and settlements is that, we don't believe in BDS, we don't believe in boycotts, divestments and sanctions. This is not necessarily part of BDS, although obviously it can be used as such, but that's really important. I think actually just to go slightly back to the Palestinian recognition and statehood question, Palestinian recognition and Palestinian statement should not be a punishment to Israelis. This should already have, there's obviously lots and lots of views on this that should already have happened. I think sometimes actually it's become a very much a go-to response from for lots of people in terms of actually to explain the situation, to have something to say, that they talk about recognition and what we think of it is neither here nor there. I think actually, if you look at particularly recently, I don't think this is one of the major calls from Palestinians, and this is Palestinians across the West Bank, across the Gaza, and again, not speaking on their behalf and never wish to. I think actually there is limited sort of discussion about recognition and statehood. I think when you're coupled with everything else that's going on. I think in terms of the US, I think there's a lot of discussion about UK influence and how relevant are we? What does global Britain mean? All this kind of stuff post Brexit, all these kind of discussions. We don't want to go into Brexit, but all of this kind of this sort of thing. And I think Britain still is relevant in the sense that actually, Britain could be developing a policy which is based on human rights and accountability and upholding international law. I think, in a sense, we always used to look at the US as being far behind us in many respects, but I think in a sense, actually, some of the political movement that is happening, and this relates to actually, I think, issues like Black Lives Matter, obviously issues related to Palestine, and actually all these coalitions that are forming on certain issues, whether they be coalitions around sexuality, coalitions around race, coalitions around rights, all these kind of stuff, and I think it's quite exciting context in terms of the US, and this includes American Palestinians, Jewish communities in the US, Latinx communities, LGBT communities, all of these, and actually there is these coalitions are really quite exciting, and I think actually the US is going beyond us in many respects, and I think. And some of that the political discussion as well. I think actually noticeably today, if you look at, say, someone like Ilhan Omar and AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and all these kind of people talking about apartheid, for example, I think politicians in the UK are far more, wary about using that term, and actually US politicians are just putting it out there. Obviously, there's a whole discussion that can be had around that, and it's worthy of discussion. And it shouldn't necessarily be used lightly. But actually, when Human Rights Watch and when B'Tselem and others come out with these statements, they're not doing it. They're not doing it just to be churlish. They're not doing it. They think they're calling a spade, and I agree with them. And I think, I think we have a lot to learn from the US in terms of how it's handling some of these issues. But also at the same time, I think, obviously different contexts and stuff like that. But I don't think we're irrelevant just yet, and at least I hope not. And I think we have a role to play, and I think this includes with partners in the US and partners in Europe. Let's not forget those as well. But our positions really need to tighten. They really need to get better, and they really need to be embedded in international law and embedded in human rights.
I think one of my frustrations is that actually the British Parliament did have a vote a number of years ago. It was a backbench debate around recognising Palestinian as an independent state. We caused a vote on that and we won the vote. So Parliament has spoken, but just as Netanyahu doesn't represent all Israelis, unfortunately, Boris Johnson doesn't represent all MPs, let alone all British citizens. So it's very challenging, particularly as an opposition MP, to try and force the government, particularly at the moment, to sort of step in and be more proactive when there are these both international and human rights violations going on. Tareq, you mentioned an independent investigation. It's one of the questions that we've got, which is, should there be an independent investigation launched to find out the main cause of the events taking place and what needs to be done to address them? I wonder if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and that's a great question. Yes, there should certainly be an independent investigation. And just to inform everyone, if the audience is unaware, that during the 2014 hostilities in Gaza, the UN Human Rights Council established an independent commission of inquiry to look into those hostilities, and that commission reported back in the summer of 2015, and in a long report they essentially assessed different patterns of alleged violations, and had some very strong recommendations, some very serious recommendations and findings in relation to essentially finding that there appeared to be the commission of war crimes in relation to certain contexts. Now, there was a vote on that report, and the UK, if my memory is correct, abstained on that report, and Israel just disregarded it. And as I mentioned, they're carrying out their own domestic investigations, but they are not independent. They're not genuine. And that's the reason why the International Criminal Court is so important, because the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. The International Criminal Court can step in when a domestic investigation and prosecutorial process is not genuine, or is either unable or unwilling to genuinely investigate. So it's been a critical development in the last few months that the prosecutor's office at the ICC has decided that it will open a criminal investigation. And it's then very alarming to see the UK actually come out against it and really, again, as I mentioned earlier, interfering with an independent institution, with an independent court. And this really needs to be pushed back on against very hard by MPs and by parliamentarians and by the public. It's really not acceptable. So just last thing to add, Sarah, is that MPs should also push for a UN Commission of Inquiry to be established into the current hostilities, because the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC, they place great weight, they place very good weight on the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry. So it's important evidence for the ICC. So that's why it's also important in that respect to push for inquiry into the current hostilities.
Thanks for that, Tareq. You're a lawyer, so I know you choose your words very wisely. And oh, don't tell me that now. You said that the investigation that Israel is doing is not genuine. That's a big statement. What evidence have you got to back that up?
Oh, Sarah, this really is. Oh yeah, I mean, this really merits a full hour's discussion. I mean, it's so important. The evidence that I would point to is B'Tselem, Yeshdin, Adala. Those are Israeli human rights organizations. Those are two Al-Nizam, Al-Haq, and Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Palestinian human rights organizations, who all have said that, in their view, the investigations are not genuine. They're actually designed to provide for impunity. And the data actually speaks for itself. There's been no charges, no prosecutions in relation to the 2014 hostilities. Likewise with the 2008-2009 hostilities. Likewise with the 2012 hostilities. So you have data plus authoritative human rights organizations, local organizations, saying that they're not genuine. And that's also LPHR's assessment too.
Thank you. To flip it around, and I forget the exact stat, but in terms of Palestinian children detained, isn't it sort of well over 90% of them actually just agree and confess that they've done the crime, which again, statistically seems an extreme anomaly?
Sawsan can answer this better than me, I'm sure, but it's over 99% conviction rate. Yeah. Which is a huge anomaly.
It speaks for itself. Thank you. Sawsan, I'm going to give you the last question, because we are running out of time, which is it right to say Israel is acting in self-defense, although they have allowed settlers to take over Sheikh Jarrah and other locations in Palestine? Briefly, please, Sawsan.
Sure, and I can't answer this question generally speaking, but based on the evidence that we've collected, and given that international law says that civilians are presumed not to be legitimate targets, and the evidence that we've collected that Israeli forces have actually targeted individual civilians and civilian infrastructure, including places where civilians are known to be sheltering, I would say that the kind of absence of a clear objective of gaining military advantage is kind of demonstrates that self-defense is not really the objective. And I think that the argument of self-defense, given the historic and apparently quite casual manner in which Israeli forces have deployed things such as artillery shells against civilians, would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. So that's all I can say about that.
Thank you. I mean, what I will say is keeping a very close eye on the news. I condemn all the violence that's going on both sides, and really hope that we can work together to put pressure on politicians around the world to at least pause, so that we can try to get people round the table to get a lasting peace, because that's what we need. Thank you very much to all of my speakers. You've been incredibly open and also very generous in your time. Thank you to everybody that has contacted me from the constituency. I will be sharing a number of different briefings. I have recorded this, but it's the first time I've recorded anything. So fingers crossed I've done it successfully, and then I'll put it on my Facebook, and you're most welcome to share it. But bear with me if I haven't recorded it properly. I apologise. Please keep in touch, constituents. To the speakers, again, thank you. You are brave people to speak out, and I know that you do it on behalf of others who are unable to have a voice, and we admire you hugely for doing that. So thank you all very much. Please keep in touch, and I am here to try and help however I can going forwards. Thank you all very much, and take care. Bye-bye.